Part 57. After encountering this fate, what kind of blood mold he has. Lang Yi was already waiting outside the door, and said respectfully, "Prince, the person who poisoned has been caught." As soon as they heard that they had caught the poisoner, Luju and Liuyan immediately pricked up their ears, wanting to hear who wanted to harm Junhua. Who? Baiming Qianyu had a cold face, and his whole body exuded a terrifying aura, which made several people around him so frightened that they didn't dare to take a breath. Mrs. Jing's personal maid, Shui Hudi. The Lang Yi is reported truthfully. A hint of gloom flashed in Baiming Qianyu's eyes. He didn't expect Mrs. Jing to be so bold and dare to blatantly persecute Junhua. It seems that he was too fond of her before. In the torture room, Shui Hudi's hands were tied to the torture rack, and her thin delicate body was beaten by the whip to the point that her skin was torn apart, which was unbearable to see. When she saw Baiming Qianyu striding into the torture room, a pitiful expression appeared on her pampered face. "Prince, it's not a slave who wants to harm young Master Shen. Please check it out." Baiming Qianyu ignored Shui Hudi, who was shouting wronged. He sat directly on the chair opposite Shui Hudi, and looked at Shui Hudi with cold eyes. "Who made you poison?" "The slaves and maids were not poisoned. They all wronged the slaves and maids. Prince, you have to be the master of the slaves and maids." Shui Hudi's little face turned pale with fright. She shook her head, shed tears, and looked pitiful. Seeing her quibble, Baiming Qianyu snorted coldly, and glanced at Lang Yi beside him. Lang Yi immediately understood, picked up the whip on the side, and stared at Shui Hudi coldly. Shui Hudi was so frightened that she trembled. Her little face was so frightened that she lost color. The wounds on her body seemed to be more painful at this moment. She tried to shrink her body, not daring to look at Lang Yi. She is well aware of the ruthlessness of the Lang Yi, and if anyone falls into his hands, almost all of them will die miserably. Lang Yi was just about to throw out the first whip, but Shui Hudi's inner defense line was instantly broken, and she shouted with tears in her eyes, "It's Mrs. Jing, it's Mrs. Jing who asked the slave to poison young Master Shen." "Why?" There was no trace of emotion in Baiming Qianyu's voice, and he stared at Shui Hudi coldly. Because. Shui Hudi hesitated. But when she saw Lang Yi raising his whip, she was so frightened that she collapsed and shouted. It was Mrs. Jing who was jealous of young Master Shen. So she wanted young Master Shen's life. Eat one's heart out. Baiming Qianyu always knew that Mrs. Jing was stingy, but he never thought that Mrs. Jing would be so stingy that she wanted Shenli's life. It seems that he was too indulgent to Mrs. Jing before, so that Mrs. Jing was so lawless that she dared to murder him. He stood up and walked towards the outside of the torture chamber, saying to the Lang Yi behind him as he walked, "Kill." His voice was undulating, as if killing a man was as easy as killing an ant. As soon as Shui Hudi heard the word kill, she was frightened and fainted on the spot. She fainted and couldn't wake up again. In Tingshui courtyard, Mrs. Jing saw Baiming Qianyu who had gone and returned, and a happy smile appeared on her face. She knew that the prince still liked her the most. For that male concubine, at most she wanted to be fresh. And when the novelty passed, then Shen Li would be forgotten by the prince in Wang Chunxuan. It's just that when she saw the gloomy face of Baiming Qianyu, her heart couldn't help but tremble. Her footsteps stopped, and she was a little overwhelmed in place. It was the first time she saw Baiming Qianyu with such a gloomy face, and her heart was uneasy. Especially when she saw that Shui Hudi hadn't come back for so long, her heart instantly sank to the bottom. Baiming Qianyu indifferently glanced at Mrs. Jing, whose expression was uneasy. And he walked straight into Mrs. Jing's room, sat on the first seat, and looked coldly at Mrs. Jing, who walked in slowly. "Prince." Mrs. Jing spoke, only to find that there was a trilling in her voice. "Shui Jing, how does this prince treat you on weekdays?" Bai Ming Qianyu asked Mrs. Jing. Mrs. Jing's body trembled. She knew that the prince already knew that she was framing Junhua behind his back, so frightened that she knelt on the ground with a poof. Her eyes were filled with tears, and she said pitifully, "The prince treats the concubine like a wife, and the concubine is grateful. But you didn't cherish it." Bai Ming Qianyu sighed lightly, stood up and was about to leave. Mrs. Jing hurriedly crawled to the feet of Bai Ming Qianyu and cried, "Prince, the concubine knows that she is wrong. Please give the concubine another chance. And the concubine will never harm others because of jealousy in the future. There are mistakes that cannot be undone." Bai Ming Qianyu dropped these words and left ruthlessly, leaving Mrs. Jing was kneeling on the spot and crying so much that her liver and intestines were broken. Bai Ming Qianyu ignored Mrs. Jing, who was crying, and he went straight back to Jing Yashwen. When he returned to his room, he saw that the person on the bed had woken up and was leaning on the head of the bed in a daze. He walked to the edge of the bed in 3 or 2 steps and sat down lightly on the edge of the bed. When Junhua saw Bai Ming Qianyu coming back, he immediately restrained the sad expression on his face, turned his head to look at Bai Ming Qianyu, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, and said politely, "Prince." Bai Ming Qianyu stretched out his hand to probe Junhua's forehead, and saw that he was still feverish, frowning. "Why don't you rest well?" "Dizzy, can't sleep." "It's not that I can't sleep. It's just that I'm scared by the continuous nightmares that I can't sleep." He sometimes dreamed of Wei Feng and Wei and dying tragically, and sometimes dreamed that the Holy Dynasty was destroyed and his imperial brother died tragically under the sword of the enemy. These nightmares were so real that he was afraid to sleep. "Wait for Leng Ning to send the medicine over, and when the time comes, you can drink it. And your body will be fine tomorrow." Bai Ming Qianyu's voice revealed a gentleness that even he couldn't detect. Junhua shook his head, for him who had been fooled once. He really didn't dare to open his mouth to drink the medicine here. Bai Ming Qianyu was just about to speak, when the door of the outer room was pushed open, and Leng Ning's voice sounded outside. "Prince, the medicine is boiled. Send it in." Leng Ning hurriedly walked in with the medicine bowl and handed it over with both hands. Bai Ming Qianyu took the medicine bowl and gave Leng Ning a look. Leng Ning immediately understood and exited the room. When Leng Ning left, Bai Ming Qianyu picked up the spoon in the medicine bowl, scooped a spoonful of medicine and put it to his lips to blow it cold, and then handed it to Junhua's mouth. To tell the truth, Junhua looked at Bai Ming Qianyu, who looked gentle, and almost opened his mouth to drink, but remembering the bowl of poisonous medicine before, he shook his head, and the refusal was obvious. Bai Ming Qianyu also knew what he was afraid of. And he was not annoyed. He took 2 large sips of the medicine bowl in a row, and replied with a stunned expression on Junhua's face. "It's not poisonous." Junhua was stunned for a long time before he came back to his senses. He didn't expect Bai Ming Qianyu to be afraid that he was afraid that the medicine would be poisonous. So he actually drank the medicine himself to prove that this bowl of medicine was not poisonous, and his heart skipped a beat, as if something sneaked into his heart, and then took root. "It's ready to drink now." Bai Ming Qianyu put the medicine spoon to Junhua's mouth and motioned for him to drink the medicine. Junhua's heart was sore and uncomfortable. He was touched by someone who had been with him for less than a day, and his heart was swollen uncomfortably, as if something was overflowing from his chest. This strange feeling made him a little flustered. Seeing that he still didn't open his mouth, Bai Ming Qianyu thought that he was angry with himself, and he was a little unhappy in his heart. He was so low and angry with him, but unfortunately the other party didn't appreciate it. His good temper was gradually exhausted, and he threatened in a loud voice, "If you don't drink it, then this prince will feed you with his mouth." Junhua was so frightened that he hurriedly took the medicine bowl in Biming Qianyu's hand, and drank it in a few gulps. After drinking it, he found that this medicine was so bitter that his whole mouth was occupied by bitterness, and he wanted to ask for sugar, but after looking at Biming Qianyu, who was not good, forget it. He placed the bowl on the table next to the bed and lay down. Looking at Junhua lying upright on the bed, Biming Qianyu didn't know what he had taken in front of him. Good looking. That's really good looking. Sword eyebrows and starry eyes, peerless, like a knife-sharpened face with sharp edges and corners, revealing a trace of coldness. Henna's a cold and arrogant personality. And he gritted his teeth with a look that doesn't take anyone in his eyes. If it weren't for the warmth of this person last night, he might have suspected that everything that happened last night was a sweet dream of his own. He took off his coat and lay down beside Junhua, smelling the faint body fragrance on Junhua's body. His expression slowed down, and his tense body also relaxed. Stretched out his hand to hug the slightly stiff person, and coaxed softly, "Good, sleep, and your body will be fine when you get up tomorrow." Junhua was speechless for a while. Junhua thought that after a few days of cultivation, he would be able to escape from the Wanyu Palace, and then return to the Holy Dynasty. However, when he woke up the next day, he found that his condition had worsened. Ahem. Junhua was dizzy, his throat was inflamed, and when he coughed slightly, there was a sharp pain in his throat. "What about the imperial doctor? Why haven't you come yet?" Biming Qianyu saw that he was uncomfortable. His heart was uncomfortable, especially the face of the person in front of him was crimson. And his whole body was amazingly hot, and he greeted the ancestor of Mrs. Jing who was so miserable to Junhua. Luju and Liuyan didn't dare to reply. After all, they only went out to ask Leng Yi for the imperial doctor, and it was impossible for them to come back so soon. Ahem. Junhua coughed violently again, which frightened Biming Qianyu to pat him on the back in a panic, but it didn't work, but instead made Junhua dizzy and nauseous, and he wanted to vomit. "Prince, I want to lie down." Junhua opened his mouth with difficulty, only to find that his neck was dumb and speechless, and he smiled bitterly in his heart. He was so big and embarrassed for the first time. Biming Qianyu hurriedly helped Junhua to lie down. Junhua looked at Biming Qianyu who looked nervous in front of him. The softness in his heart was touched. He sighed lightly, couldn't bear to look at it anymore, closed his eyes and rested. He didn't know how long he slept this time. He only vaguely remembered that it was very noisy around him. The noise made him have a splitting headache, and he wanted to open his eyes and scold a few words, but he couldn't open his eyes. I don't know when he lost consciousness later, but when he opened his eyes, he happened to see the tired Biming Qianyu looking at him. "Awake? Is there anything wrong with it? Hungry?" Biming Qianyu was so nervous that he threw out several questions in a row, which made Junhua does not know which question to answer first for a while. After hesitating for a long time, he asked, "How long have I been asleep?" When he opened his mouth, his neck was still a little dumb, but it was much better than before he fell into a coma. Speaking of this, Biming Qianyu looked a little bad, and replied sullenly, 4 days. Junhua never thought that he would sleep for 4 days. The imperial doctor said that you should have been cold in your body before, hurting the vitality in your body, and because of that night. Biming Qianyu was very remorseful. He had known that Junhua would be so sick, he shouldn't have played so much that night. And he shouldn't have gone to the palace until dark the next day because of the disappearance of Prince Junhua of the Holy Dynasty. Junhua didn't like the look of self-reproach on Baiming Qianyu's face, which made him afraid that the day he left, he would be reluctant. He hurriedly diverted Baiming Qianyu's attention and said, "I'm hungry, do you have anything to eat?" "Yes, you wait." Baiming Qianyu hurriedly said to Leng Ning outside the door. "Leng Ning, send a bowl of porridge." Leng Ning outside the door answered, and then the footsteps walked away. It seemed that he had gone to the kitchen to carry porridge. Speechless for a while. The air was a little frozen. Junhua raised his eyes and saw that Baiming Qianyu had been staring at him, and he couldn't stand this atmosphere and struggled to sit up. But he was weak and didn't have the strength to sit up at all. Baiming Qianyu hurriedly reached out to help him up, and put a pillow behind his back, so that he would be more comfortable leaning on the head of the bed. "Thank you." It was rare for Junhua to say thank you. He leaned weakly on the head of the bed behind him. And he asked tentatively, "Prince, there are people in the family, you don't have to guard me alone. After all, there are so many major events in the court that require you to preside over the overall situation. Isn't there still King Jinxiang in the court? Speaking of the current matter." Baiming Qianyu's expression was a little gloomy. If the Holy Dynasty was defeated, their Ri-Yao dynasty would not be able to escape the end of being annexed by the Wangyu dynasty. "I secretly scolded the emperor of the Holy Dynasty in my heart for being too stupid, and at this juncture, he actually sent Prince Junhua to Jinghe Kingdom. What is this not to do to find death? But you're the regent." Junhua knew that the rights of Baiming Qianyu were more than those of King Jinxiang, and many major matters were decided by Baiming Qianyu. "You still care more about yourself. Your voice is still hoarse, and you are still in the mood to care about national affairs. I'm worried about the Ri-Yao dynasty. If the Holy Dynasty is defeated, our Ri-Yao dynasty will not escape the fate of being destroyed." Junhua knew that their Holy Dynasty and the Ri-Yao dynasty were grasshoppers tied to a rope. If the Holy Dynasty was defeated, the Ri-Yao dynasty would not escape the end of being annexed. Similarly, if the Ri-Yao dynasty was annexed, the Holy Dynasty would not escape the fate of being destroyed. Seeing that his worried expression did not seem to be fake, Baiming Qianyu comforted him softly. "You don't have to worry about this. This prince has already dispatched troops to Jiahe Gate. Always pay attention to the movements of Jinghe Kingdom. If they dare to form an alliance with the nomadic dynasty, we will send troops to attack Jinghe Kingdom." At the moment, what he feared most was that the people of the nomadic dynasty and the Jinghe Kingdom would join forces to attack the Holy Dynasty. If these two countries are united, the Holy Dynasty will definitely not be able to escape the danger of being destroyed. If the nomadic dynasty is allowed to march and garrison in the Central Plains, the Wangyu dynasty will definitely be afraid that the nomadic dynasty will annex the surrounding small countries and become dominant. Then the Wangyu dynasty will extend a black hand to their Ri-Yao dynasty. At that time, there was the Wangyu dynasty on the left, and the nomadic dynasty on the right was ready to attack. And no matter which country they cooperated with, they would eventually be in danger of being wiped out. Junhua saw that Baiming Qianyu had a sad face. It seemed that he was worried about the current predicament, and he was a little unbearable, and he comforted softly, "Don't worry. Maybe the Holy Dynasty can make a big comeback." He had received a letter from his imperial brother stating that he had a secret weapon against the nomadic dynasty, and that the Holy Dynasty should be able to defeat the nomadic dynasty. Seeing him comforting himself, a trace of sweetness crossed his heart. But he knew that it was too difficult for the Holy Dynasty to defeat the nomadic dynasty, especially now that Prince Junhua has disappeared in Jinghe Kingdom. Jinghe Kingdom. which is afraid that the Holy Dynasty will survive this difficulty, will never let the Holy Dynasty survive this difficulty. Junhua rested in the room for a few more days. And as his body gradually recovered, he finally got the consent of Biming Qianyu and was able to walk out of the room to breathe. The snow outside had melted, revealing dead grass and trees that had been frozen to death, and looked bleak. Luju and Liuyan waited behind him, handing him the hand warmer for a while, asking him if his body could stand it, which made him dumbfounded. Although he had a serious illness, he was not so weak that he would fall when the wind blew. Walking out of Jing Yashwen, the people outside saw him all saluting respectfully, which made him a little suspicious. You must know that on the second day after entering the Wanyu Palace, these subordinates bowed to him perfunctorily, and then talked about it behind his back as if he would stay alone in the empty room in the future. Although he was suspicious, he didn't dig deeper. He saw a small pavilion in front of him. He was tired of walking. He originally wanted to go into the small pavilion to sit and recover his strength, but when he got closer, he found that there were several elegant and beautiful women sitting inside. He didn't want to disturb a few people, but one of them didn't seem to want to let him go, and screamed, "Ah! Isn't this brother Shen, who has been sick for more than 10 days, has finally given up the prince's courtyard?" The woman's voice was very sharp and harsh, especially the words that could not hide her jealousy, which made people very uncomfortable to hear. Junhua frowned lightly, and he didn't like to argue about such a non-nutritious topic. So he turned away with a cold face. The woman looked at Junhua's back. Her voice was so angry that she raised her voice, and scolded, "You are a tall fart. If you are really high, you will not dominate the prince's courtyard and not leave. Forget my sister, why bother with him? You don't know that the prince doesn't like men when the prince is fresh. Who will remember who he is?" The soft and boneless woman beside her pulled the woman with a charming face, and said loudly on purpose, she wants Junhua to hear that the prince is just pure freshness when he plays with him, and when the novelty passes, the prince will not spoil him. "Sister, have you forgotten how Mrs. Jing died?" A woman in a blue palace dress said slowly. The woman has an excellent appearance. Her skin is like clotted fat, her apricot eyes are shiny, and her temperament is elegant, like an orchid in a hollow valley. She stared at Junhua's back, the light in her eyes flickered and dimmed, and she didn't know what she was calculating. Junhua, who was walking away, paused when he heard that Mrs. Jing was dead, and asked Liuyan beside him with a surprised face, "Mrs. Jing is dead?" "Yes, young master, that night it was Mrs. Jing who sent Shui Hudi to poison your medicine, and when the prince learned about it, he gave Mrs. Jing a piece of white silk." Liuyan replied truthfully, "For the person who wants to harm him." Junhua has no sympathy. He bowed his head and said that he knew, and then went back to his small courtyard, Wang Chunxuan. Now he only needs to recuperate in peace, and when his condition is better, he can leave the Riyao dynasty. It was no accident that night, Biming Qianyu, who came back from the palace, came to his courtyard with a cold face to arrest people. "This prince asked you to recuperate in Jing Yashwen. What did you do when you came to Wang Chunxuan?" Biming Qianyu asked Junhua, who was drinking porridge with a cold face. Junhua didn't even raise his eyelids, and replied indifferently, "I like to be alone." It's not that he really likes to be alone, but he doesn't want to have too much to do with Biming Qianyu. Otherwise he is afraid that he won't be able to do it without concern when he leaves. Biming Qianyu didn't like the indifferent expression on his face the most. Obviously facing each other, but it seemed to be separated by 10,000 mountains, so that he couldn't touch or reach it. He sat opposite Junhua, staring directly at Junhua, who was drinking porridge with deep eyes. Junhua's heart that he thought was strong was defeated under the eyes of Baiming Qianyu. He put down the spoon and looked at Baiming Qianyu. Prince, you also have several concubines. If I live in Jing Yashuen for a long time, it will definitely cause their dissatisfaction, so. Are you jealous? Baiming Qianyu was in a much better mood, and asked expectantly. Junhua is also a man, of course he knows what Baiming Qianyu wants to hear, so he nodded with a clear conscience. It's not enough to be jealous, as long as you can send away the North Hell. It shouldn't be too much to say something against your will. Seeing him nod, Baiming Qianyu's heart, which had been stuffy for several days, was instantly released. And his gloomy handsome face also showed a smile. If you don't like them, this prince will be retired. Ahem. Junhua choked on his own saliva. He never expected that Baiming Qianyu would say this. Seeing him coughing, Baiming Qianyu thought that he was still not well with typhoid fever. So he hurriedly came behind him and reached out to pat his back gently. Junhua stopped coughing and moved his body to the side, keeping a safe distance from Baiming Qianyu. When he turned around, he saw that Baiming Qianyu sank his face again, and hurriedly changed the topic. Prince, don't rest. If this spreads, others may not be able to slander me behind my back. Of course. What he said was just to comfort Baiming Qianyu. In fact, what he was most afraid of was that Baiming Qianyu would really finish the concubine room in the house, and when he left in the future, Baiming Qianyu would definitely be mad at him. They dare. If anyone dares to talk about Junhua behind his back, find a reason to kill them. Junhua was really afraid that Baiming Qianyu would take a concubine, so he persuaded, Prince, it will be more troublesome to take a concubine after this retirement. So it is better not to stop. Then I won't take a concubine. This is really not something that Baiming Qianyu said out of his will. He had always thought that he could accept a man. And he went to the small house to find a little man, but before he could reach out and touch him, he was pushed away with a look of disgust. It seems that he can only accept Junhua's touch. And since sleeping with Junhua that night, he found that he was no longer interested in women, especially the concubines in the palace who always pretended to be weak and pitied him. Which made him upset for a while. It's still Junhua, the person is good looking, and the voice is low and good sounding, so people can't help but indulge in it. He stared straight at Junhua, making Junhua's scalp tingle, and a cool breath rushed from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. Junhua swallowed a mouthful of saliva with difficulty, and slowly stood up, trying to escape from this place. As soon as he raised his foot, Baiming Qianyu behind him grabbed him who wanted to escape, and wrapped his hands around his waist, leaving him with nowhere to escape. Prince, my body, unwell. As soon as he opened his mouth, Junhua realized that he would actually tie knots when he spoke. Just once, okay? Baiming Qianyu asked softly in his ear. Junhua opened his mouth to refuse. But Baiming Qianyu took the lead in covering his mouth, and said with an evil smile in his ear, Ziqing doesn't speak, this prince will let you agree. Agree to a fart? You have the ability to let go of this prince's mouth. Said yes once, but someone died shamelessly, pestered and did it again and again, making Junhua tired enough. And finally recovered some of his physical strength, but he was tossed like this and exhausted. The consequence of overindulgence is that Junhua rested for many days before he regained his vitality. Feeling that his body was gradually recovering, Junhua pondered when to find an excuse to go out for a walk, and then leave the Riyao dynasty. Baiming Qianyu also stared at Junhua all day long. And when he saw that his body was almost recovered, he immediately possessed himself with a hungry wolf and did an indescribable thing with Junhua in his arms. Junhua really wants to die. What kind of blood mold has he reached this year? Will he meet Baiming Chia Niu?